A young boy is abducted from his suburban neighborhood only to be found alive 7 years later. What happened? Who did it? And what are the lasting consequences of an event like this? I want to warn you that today's story is graphic. We're going to cover just about every kind of abuse there is, so fair warning. With that said, let's review. Hello, everyone, and welcome to my channel. Today, we're delving into the infamous Stainer cases as told in the 2022 docuseries Captive Audience. Let's begin with a bit of background. Delbert and Kay Stainer married very shortly after meeting and went on to have 5 children, 3 girls and 2 boys. It is the boys, Stephen and Carrie, that we'll be discussing today. The family settled in Merced, California, which is a suburban area and one of the entrances of Yosemite National Park. The children actually passed that entrance on their way home from school. In the late 60s, early 70s, Merced was said to be a very close-knit, quiet community where nobody locked their doors and everyone looked out for each other. Stephen Gregory Stainer was born April 18th, 1965. Stephen was said to be a sweet, shy boy, very respectful and very accommodating. These are not the descriptors that people use for his older brother, Carrie. Born August 13th, 1961, Carrie was said to be more standoffish, just solitary, enjoyed his own company. However, there were some things about his behavior that people found as odd. Through my own research, I did see that allegedly at one point he may have exposed himself to his sister's friend, which would definitely qualify for the moniker of odd. It was said that Carrie was a decent artist and had an interest in comic books. That's kind of the only accolade I was able to find, which is going to make sense as we progress. On December 4th, 1974, 7-year-old Stephen was waiting outside of his school to be picked up by his mom. Kay Stainer was held up at a hardware store picking up a part, and again, because this was a very safe neighborhood and Stephen did know how to make his way home from school, he just started that journey. A few blocks away from his house, 2 men approached Stephen and they essentially convinced him to let them give him a ride home. Stephen agreed to this, but as soon as he got into the vehicle, they made off with him. Edward Murphy and Kenneth Parnell were co-workers at the Yosemite Lodge, which was a hotel located inside of the park. It is unclear what Edward was getting out of this arrangement, but Kenneth Parnell, who I'll just call Parnell for the rest of the story, his intentions became clear very early on. On or around the 3rd day of Stephen's abduction, Parnell approaches him and tells him essentially that his parents no longer want him, that he had done something to upset them, and he said that he had also legally changed Stephen's name to Dennis. Stephen wasn't really 100% certain of Parnell's story, and he even tried to escape at one point. Very soon after he left, he got lost and returned to the cabin because it was the only place he knew how to get to. Parnell and Stephen fled shortly after the escape attempt. Back at the Stainer house, Stephen's abduction became a media sensation. The police were out, there were helicopters and a search party, and everyone tried very hard to find Stephen. As the weeks became months, became years, no one was really talking about Stephen's story anymore. There would be an occasional clue that would go nowhere, or if there was another famous kidnapping, such as Patty Hearst in 1974, they would revisit Stephen's story, but for the most part, the public had moved on. The family was obviously in turmoil. Dell Stainer would follow behind trucks if they looked suspicious to him. Kay was not doing too much better. She would not leave the house at all because she wanted someone to be home in case Stephen had called. This went on for about 2 to 3 years after Stephen's disappearance. The children spent a lot of time with relatives at this point. It's said that they just grew to not talk about Stephen at all. Out of all of the children, Carrie may have been having a worse go of it. He was the oldest, being 11 years old when Stephen was kidnapped. His relationship with Dell soured tremendously at this point, and where he was already a more solitary person, he became a bit reclusive. I want to mention also, because it does become important later, around this time during Stephen's abduction and spending all this time with relatives, he alleges that he was assaulted by a family member. About 5 years into the abduction, Stephen and Parnell had moved around many times. At this point, they had settled into a place called Comchi, California. Comchi literally translates to the valley within the hills. So it is a very remote area, about 250 miles away from Merced. Parnell had enrolled Stephen into school at this point. Of course, now he's being known as Dennis. And even though folks did have trouble pulling that personality, out of him, he didn't struggle for friends. He had a close-knit friend group. He also had a girlfriend at this time, and he had made some close relationships with teachers. Of course, we know that Stephen's story was not all that it appeared to be at that time. Even neighbors and his friends had noticed some oddities. He was always dirty and ill clothed. He would have holey shoes, three pairs of pants that didn't really fit that great. So there were certainly signs of neglect. But conversely, there were some folks who thought that Stephen may have been overindulged. At 14 years old, he was smoking cigarettes and he would drive around in Parnell's car on their property. Neighbors and the parents of Stephen's friends were very weirded out by Parnell. They were not into it. Stephen's house was the one that they were not allowed to go to. Between the false freedoms of, using his vehicle and smoking cigarettes and just the flat out lies that Parnell was telling Stephen, he was pretty effectively able to control him. But in the event that that didn't work, he did threaten to reveal their secret. The secret being that Stephen was being abused by Parnell and had been almost since the very beginning. Even with the lies, manipulation, etc., Parnell became very nervous about Stephen's friend group and the relationships he was forming with other adults in his life. So they decided to flee again. They soon ended up about 40 miles outside of Ukiah, California. So this is around the time where Parnell was looking for another little boy to add to their family. There were multiple kidnapping attempts, and Stephen alleges that he was deliberately foiling those attempts. Somehow, Parnell was able to enlist the help of another minor around Stephen's age to assist him in the successful kidnapping of Timmy White, and this was on February 14th, 1980. On the night of March 1st, 1980, while Parnell was at work, Stephen and Timmy escaped the cabin and started the 40-mile journey back to Ukiah. At this point, Timmy had been gone for about 2 weeks. So as soon as they laid eyes on him, they knew exactly who it was and they immediately contacted his family. However, they had some questions about the older boy. When they asked him who he was, he said, "I know my first name is Stephen." There were hundreds of people outside of the Stainer house when Stephen was reunited with his family. This was followed by interviews and press conferences over the next several weeks. The public seemed confused by Parnell's motivations because they didn't show any outward signs of abuse. They were beginning to suspect that Parnell may have just been an odd guy who wanted to have children but didn't want to be married or be in a romantic relationship, which doesn't make a ton of sense because for some of that time he had a live-in girlfriend. So I don't know how they came to that. They did ask Stephen if there had been any abuse of a sexual nature, to which he denied. He said that that did not happen. They did find evidence in Parnell's possessions that proved to be solid enough for them to understand that abuse had taken place. At trial, it came out that Stephen's kidnapping was Parnell's second offense against a child. And so do keep that in mind as we go through the sentencing information here. Murphy, Parnell's accomplice for Stephen's kidnapping, received 5 years. The minor that aided Parnell in Timmy's kidnapping was sentenced to a youth labor camp. Parnell's live-in girlfriend didn't receive any time. She ended up being a witness for the prosecution and so didn't get any time. Parnell received 7 years for Timmy White's kidnapping, and he received 7 years for Stephen's kidnapping. However, because of the laws that were on the books at the time, He couldn't be charged for both of those crimes at 7 years. Stephen's kidnapping was only allotted an additional 20 months of prison. I don't know. I don't know. So after 9 years, Parnell walked free for both of those kidnappings. So, really quickly, I just want to touch on what became of him. In 2004, at the age of 71, he was caught in a sting operation for trying to buy a child from the black market. It ended up that he was discussing this with police. There were no children harmed. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility for parole and died in jail in 2008. So, small blessings. Despite his mother's wishes, Stephen did not receive any mental health counseling for his ordeal. He also wasn't really allowed to talk about his life as Dennis. When asked about therapy, Stephen said, quote, "There were lots of suggestions about getting therapy from people, but I just said no. I mean, I'm doing just fine." Stephen began drinking heavily shortly after he returned home. He also crashed a few vehicles. It was also said that he had girls running in and out of his life as well. In his late teens, early 20s, he met and married a woman named Jody. They went on to have two children together, and his family seemed to really mellow him out. He wanted to do his best to get his life in order. He returned to school and started taking classes to become a police officer. Also, around this time, Stephen agreed to have a television movie made of his life. He even made a cameo at one point as a police officer. This film went on to earn one Golden Globe nomination and four Emmy nominations. However, on the night before the Emmys that year, Stephen was tragically struck in a hit and run accident and passed away. He was only 23 years old. After the attention of the film and the tragic accident, the Stainer family soon began to fade from the media spotlight, at least for a few years. As mentioned earlier, Carrie Stainer was hugely affected by the disappearance of Stephen, and even more so by the media circus around his return. As an adult, Carrie struggled holding down work. At one point, he worked for a neighbor's glass fitting company, but he had a pretty explosive nervous breakdown. And it's said that a lot of these work struggles may have stemmed from a long period of untreated anxiety. In the late 90s, Carrie did meet a woman. She was a waitress who worked near his work. Their relationship was said to be doing pretty well, and he even started forming a relationship with her two daughters. On February 16th, 1999, Jan's son was waiting in the San Francisco airport for his wife, daughter, and his daughter's friend. They were flying into the San Francisco airport from Yosemite National Park, and together they were going to fly down to Arizona to finish out their vacation. Jans decided to fly down to Arizona, just assuming that they had took a direct flight. After arriving in Arizona and still not hearing from his family after a day or two, he contacted the Yosemite police. The police checked Cedar Lodge, which is where the women were staying, and they couldn't find any evidence of foul play per se. It just sort of looked like they checked out. However, they did find it odd that the car that Mrs. Sund had rented was still missing, hadn't been returned yet. They sent out search parties all over the national park and they didn't find any sign of anything. 4 weeks after the disappearance, police found a burned out vehicle, and inside that vehicle was the 41-year-old Mrs. Sund and their daughter's 16-year-old friend. Another 2 weeks pass, and the police receive a handwritten note with a hand drawn map. The map did lead to the body of the 15-year-old daughter. Immediately, the police noticed that the locations of the bodies were secluded. Also, the daughter was found wrapped in a blanket that they were able to trace back to Cedar Lodge. So they knew that they were dealing with a local. On July 22nd, 1999, the police were sent to do a welfare check on a 26-year-old naturist who worked at Yosemite National Park. She had missed work, and that was known to be very unlike her. Sadly, her body was found behind her home in a nearby stream. When the police asked around, neighbors mentioned a truck that was very known to them as Carrie Stainer's truck. Now, the police had recently spoken to Carrie Stainer because he was the handyman and a resident of the Cedar Lodge. When the police go back to question Carrie, they also check his truck and his apartment, where they find some pretty incriminating evidence. One of the things that they found was what they called his murder kit. When presented with all of this evidence, Carrie did admit to all four murders. He also said that he had plans of harming his girlfriend and her two daughters as well. Carrie said that he had had fantasies of harming women since he was about 7 years old. He had violent visions, he had some auditory hallucinations as well, and he said that he would have kept killing if he had not been caught. During his very first interview with a journalist, he requested that his story be turned into a movie of the week, which was a television movie series from the 80s, not unlike the television movie that was made about Stephen's case. In an open letter that Carrie wrote while in prison, he did say that he didn't do this for attention or notoriety. However, the request, along with that statement, seemed to conflict to me. Carrie's attorneys used the insanity defense. They had 6 clinicians look at him and they came back with a myriad of diagnoses. There was brain damage, mild autism spectrum disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, paraphilia, and trichomania. I'm so sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong. The defense also said that the Stainers had a family history of alcoholism and abuse, and that was also affecting Carrie's state of mind. The judge was not impressed by the defense's case. They couldn't really prove that any of those conditions and traumas meant that he wasn't still culpable for his actions. Couple that with the fact that he was sending letters to the police and also trying to obfuscate evidence by hiding it. If anything, they proved the opposite. So Carrie Stainer was found guilty of the 4 murders and he was sentenced to death. He is currently awaiting that sentence on death row in San Quentin State Penitentiary. So, what were my findings from Captive Audience? Stephen Stainer's young life was rife with traumas. He survived the victimization that Parnell inflicted upon him, only to be further harassed by the media. And this is while being deprived of mental health care that could have been instrumental in his recovery process. Despite all odds, Stephen worked very hard to better himself and champion others, which to me is the definition of a true hero. Carrie Stainer's life was also rife with tragedy. He lost a brother and had to grow up in a home that was in active mourning for years. And surely that alone would make for a rough childhood, but you compound that with alleged abuse by his uncle, and it is a very unfortunate set of circumstances that he was put in. However, abuse is not an excuse to abuse. He savagely took the life of 4 women who were entirely innocent parties in this. And while Stephen used his past to protect others, Carrie used his to prey upon others. So that's what we'll leave today's story. Did you find Captive Audience interesting? Because I surely did. Let me know all your thoughts in the comments below, and be sure to let me know what you'd like me to review next. But until then, stay safe, stay hydrated, and I'll see you next time. Also around this time, Stephen agreed